Hello students, my name is Shreya and this is the second part of analysis of the December 2018 English Literature question paper. This is the first time that UGC NET was conducted by NTA, and so there was an expectation of change of pattern, and if I wouldn't call it a change of pattern, and if I would call it a change of pattern, I would call it for better, right? Because the question paper changed the way we were studying for NET. It became more understanding, right, than learning, or mindless learning rather, right? So it was an important aspect that of things that changed. So in the first part I've already discussed the kind of questions that came from British literature. So I've not discussed obviously all questions. We can't do it in this in the short span of this video lecture, but what I've done is I've picked up about 10-12 questions and I've given you a kind of breakdown as to what is the kind of questions that are coming, right? So now for the other portions, let's go on to world literature first. The questions from this portion were direct, right? It was not too much that you had to ponder over. The questions were pretty straightforward, right? If they ask you about the work and author, it was also not as twisted as the questions used to be. Even if they ask you about the category of poets, it was not a twisted question. It was a very direct question, right? So now another focus was, Indian literature used to be a center. For I remember nets, about 2 to 3 nets prior to this time, Indian literature used to be a lot of focus for the question paper, but they suddenly stopped asking Indian literature and were focusing on Canadian literature. So your Margaret Atwood, Lawrence, then they were focusing on Australian literature, right? Afro-American, American, and these were the focus, and Indian literature was somewhat lagging behind, right? But this time around, there were questions from Indian literature. There was a question on 𝐒𝐤𝐡𝐻 as well, right? Who's an Indian linguist, and he's by the way given the word world English. Right? He's coined this word called world English, right? Then there were direct questions, there were questions on Indian literature, and when I was discussing with you the questions on British literature, I told you the category of poets or the characterization of poets were often asked. So here also they asked you the fireside poets. So the fireside poets are a group of 5 poets from US, and these poets are also known as schoolroom poets. Right, and because I'm telling you, I'll tell you the names of these fireside poets, right? So there's Longfellow, right? There's Gullen Bryant, there's Greenleaf Whittier, there's Russell Lowell, and there's Wandell Holmes. I'm only writing the last names, right? So these are the 5 fireside poets who were very sentimental in their works. The writing was very sentimental. Then they were more for convention than experimentation, right? So they were conventional, and their writing was a lot of their writing was sentimental, right? Then there was another different thing was that Kafka was asked, but not his popular plays. So there was no Trial or Metamorphosis. Instead, Castle was asked. The Castle was asked. Then there was a question on the Australian writer David Malouf and his text Ransom, very important text. Right? Then there was a question of matching of the authors with their text, which included Soyinka's work and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So it was Thiong'o and Soyinka in the list, and 2 others, right? Not very unknown. Then there was a question on first black slave narrative. So the questions were varied. Some of them were direct, some of them I agree were confusing, but more or less you could answer questions from world literature. The important pointers for you for the next exam is focus on Indian literature, little bit more, or at least more names of other works of the author except the benchmark texts, right? So works and authors is important, has become important after this exam, right? Moving on then to literary criticism and theory. Here I would like to tell you a lot of literary jargon was used, right? So I've already made a PPT, I've already made a video lecture here on literary theory and criticism, and the basic ideas I've given you already, right? But in this case, for literary criticism and theory, a lot of literary jargon was used. So they were trying to confuse you through a lot of literary jargon. But the key here is going to be to remember the key concept, right? So for instance, if for new criticism, the key concept is keeping author's intent out. Right? Try and sticking to these words. Author's intent must be kept out. Right? And then around this fact, whatever literary jargon you come across, you should be able to handle it well. Now for to tackle questions on literary criticism and theory, it's also important for you to remember now the fact that you must also enhance your reading of literary criticism and theory. So now a lot of students have a problem in just going through the compilation that are done by, say, Nair or Peter Barry or T.S. Eagleton, right? So they have a problem in going back to those only. So leave aside reading the actual text in its original form, right? But the exam sort of now has started demanding you to be a little more well-read when it comes to your tackling of questions of literary criticism and theory. Right, so let's look at some of the questions. There was one question that gave you important key concepts of theory. So like it gave you womanism, the idea of womanism, which was introduced by Alice Walker. Right, then it gave interpellation, which is Althusser. Right, and two other concepts that were asked in the similar chart like format, right? Then there was another question, the third one. This is not like a entire. It's not like a compilation in its entirety, but these are some of the important questions that I've found and brought it back. So there was a question, like I told you, about new criticism, which does not look at the author's intent. So it does not intend to go back and look at the author. Right, so there was that question. There was a question on deconstruction, as to what are one of the principles of deconstruction, right? The answer was of the nature, so there was a question on deconstruction. There was a question on new criticism, new historicism. The question on deconstruction was of the nature, which of these are one of the important characteristics, and it went down to saying that the distortion that exists, the concept of aphoria was asked indirectly. So aphoria is a concept of there being a inherent contradiction within a text. So in that context, a question was asked. Then there was questions on particular essays. Again, in this series, there was also a question on what is an implied reader. Right, so an implied reader can be said to be an ideal reader who's the perfect audience or the perfect reader for a certain text, which was a term given by Wolfgang Isser. Right, there's the thing about ideal reader. Then there were questions directly from essays. So there was a question on Horace, which asked you who among the following says poetry should both delight and instruct. Right, so poetry is both delightful and moral, or giving you instructions, right? Then there was a question, who asked you to banish poets? So Plato did, right? This paper also then makes us focus on classical essays, right? So there was a tendency of the UGC to not ask too many. So CBSE did not ask too many questions on Horace or Plato for that matter, or Aristotle for that matter. But now NTA has asked you question on Horace, NTA has asked you question on Plato as well. So there is a good chance for them to ask further questions on Aristotle or Longinus and his idea of sublime. So it's important for you to then go back for the next exam and do these as well. Right? Then there was a question on I.A. Richards' text, which is known as practical criticism, which I've also discussed in one of the previous video lectures. I'll put the link somewhere here or somewhere down the description box. Right? So there were questions like this. There were some questions that were directly from theories and some others that were from particular essays. So there was Roland Barthes' Death of the Author. Right? So that was a question. Then there was an essay by and there was a question on George Orwell's essay Why I Write also. Right, so there was a lot of singular essays that were looked at, and there was also theory. Now looking at ELT a little bit, not too many questions. Again, this is not a portion that they asked too many questions from, but there was a question on Butler English. Right, which is what? Which is a kind of Pidgin. I've already told you, I think, in some of the previous lectures, the meaning of Pidgin and Creole. So Pidgin is when you use language basically to just communicate, and when two people are of different language, come from different language together, and they need to have some common ground to start communication. That's Pidgin. But when Pidgin becomes a language and somebody starts inheriting it, it becomes a Creole. So this was a Pidgin that was introduced during the colonial times. Right? So the first trade started from Madras. So this is the same region where this Butler English or this Pidgin originated from, Madras. Then there is a question on Braj Kachru also, where they ask you that Indians have a tendency to bring together two forms. So there are words that are created from English as well as Hindi. So the example for which was, and the question asked gave you certain examples, and the correct answer was lathi charge. Right? So the idea that lathi is an Indian word, and it's a word from the Hindi language, and then charge is an English word, and there is a tendency to bring these two together quite often. Right? So there were the questions of these nature from ELT, not too many, but again, often asked. Not too many questions are asked, but 2 to 3 questions, and if you know a little bit about this and you've gone through little bit of preparation, you should be able to tackle these. Then for rhetorics, there was a question on vehicle and tenor, which are what? Which are two parts of a metaphor or a simile or a synecdoche or a metonym, which are what? So your tenor is the subject to which various attributes are given, and your vehicle is the object whose attributes are borrowed, right? So this is the difference between vehicle and tenor. Then there was a question on metaphor. There was a question on metaphor specifically. So why is this metaphor used or something like that. Then there was a question on synecdoche, which is when a part of something is made to represent the whole. So arms are used for men, right? And similar examples. Right? So there was also for prosody, there was a question on pentameter, which is a combination of 5 meters. Right? So questions of this nature often feature, and this is again a portion that's not very difficult to tackle, like the ELT. And ELT and rhetorics together make about 5 to 6 marks, and these are easy 5 to 6 marks to score. Right? So this is all about the paper. So this was all about the paper, the kind of questions that came from each portion. Now a little bit about as to how you must proceed for the next exam. So for the next exam, certain things that I've observed. There was more reading for you to do for each particular question than direct answers. Right? So all the people who gave the exam this time around felt that the time was utilized, which was never the case for your previous nets, right? You for the English literature subjects or the art subjects, you always had so much time in hand, which was not the case this time, because the questions were more involved. The questions were more critical in nature, right? The second factor is, again, like I said in the first video only, it was not a difficult paper, but it was a very different paper. It in fact was a paper of literature like literature should be versus the papers that were coming, right? Now what is the what you should do now? Now it's important for you to focus on poems more. Understand the poem rather than learn the lines, because once you understand it, you would remember the lines, right? Now there's no slavish dependence on memory. So there's no dependence on memory. Obviously you need to learn certain things up, but there's no slavish dependence on memory that whoever remembers can remember everything, right? Now there's also with your understanding, you need to understand the central ideas of texts, the kind of literary techniques that are involved, the kind of literary circles that were created. So all these things are important for you to remember. And lastly, the paper was more intelligent and less impractical, right? So I felt the paper this time around was more intelligent. So what should be your task from then on? You should read literature as literature is to be read. Right? It's no longer the kind of paper where all of us used to say that doing literature is different, but clearing the net is another ball game altogether. Now it comes in the same trajectory of things, right? Now your reading should be detailed as well, like you do for your internal exams or exams of the university, right? And there should be a focus on poems as well, and there should be in poems also, in world literature there should be focus on Indian literature. In British and other literatures, the focus should still be on poems. And lastly, everything should be done with the intention of learning, should be done with the intention of understanding and learning, and not mugging up, right? So these were some of the important aspects of the paper that I discussed with you, and also gave you a little bit insight as to how you must proceed with your preparation from now on, right? So if you think this video was helpful, you must subscribe to the channel, and if you need any other video lectures on any other important topic, you must leave that down in the comment box as well. Thank you.